Hi guys, welcome to Theme 2. This is our first discussion on American economic growth over the years. And today's kind of study and today's topic is really on kind of the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and also kind of the growth of monopolies and how they develop in this country and how it impacts the American way of life. And I really like to show this photo early on, and you can really see this is a photo of New York City at the turn of the century. It's very densely crowded, but you don't see the cars, you don't see the power lines, you don't see the traditional images of what you would think of a major city. Instead, you're seeing horse and carriage. You're seeing very crowded streets of people selling goods. You're seeing people with their laundry hanging outside of their windows, right? Because there's no such thing as a washer and dryer at this point. You don't see the phone lines or the electrical lines that would crisscross the cities later on. And so this really is a different time and a different era compared to what most of us are used to. When we really want to know how America became an economic superpower, it really begins back in the mid-1800s, during what's known as the Industrial Revolution. And there's really four reasons why America grows so mightily in the field of business, where that economic growth happens. And there's four kind of main reasons. One is natural resources. Coal, oil, iron really become mainstays in the American economy. People suddenly now can get this a lot easier. It's mined in a lot faster. There's people who are wanting this. We'll talk about processes for enriching this. We'll make it so much easier and so much more abundant that the price will actually fall for all of these goods, making it much, much more easier for people to use these on a regular basis. Immigration is a big factor at this time, and we'll talk about in the next video series about how immigration really kind of comes to the forefront as a major political issue. But because of the steady flow of immigrants from Asia and Europe, there suddenly now is a ready workforce. Whereas before maybe you had people who were mostly farmers, who maybe lived out on the land. These people come to this country looking for a new life, and they settle in cities, and they start to take the factory jobs that had been previously open because nobody was there to take those positions. You also have a really kind of this capitalist mentality and laissez-faire economic policy. If you remember from 7th grade, we talked about laissez-faire at length, and it's the idea that the government really should stay out of the way when it comes to business. Let businesses run themselves, let them take care of themselves, and really should just kind of get out of the way and not be involved in this. And so that really becomes something, kind of a major point in American society at this time, because what's going to happen is businesses are going to become much, much more profitable, and the government really is going to stay out of the way until what's known as the progressive era, when we get there a little later. Finally, you get this really big growth in American ingenuity. At this time in the 1800s, there's over 400,000 patents that are applied for. Many of those becomes inventions like the telegraph, the telephone, the sewing machine, the elevator. All of those are going to come out from there. In fact, this is the time of Thomas Edison and when he gets the moniker of the Wizard of Menlo Park, where he's there working on countless inventions throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one of the areas that has the biggest growth during the 1800s is railroads. In the wake of the Civil War, 1865, well, we haven't really talked about the Civil War yet, but during the Civil War, railroads become really pivotal in the war movement, and people really begin to see that this is something that we can really bank on. We can make money off of this. And so at the end of the Civil War in 1865, there's about 35,000 miles of track. By 1900, there's over 200,000 miles of track. And it really becomes the interstate system of America. Today, we think of highways and interstates of tractor trailers moving goods back and forth. At this time, the railroads are that. Really, people begin to start claiming land. Towns begin to crop up around these railroad tracks. You'll get what's known as boom towns, where people will build cities that are stops along the way. And the idea is that you could stop there, get off the train, get something to eat, maybe stay in a hotel room, right? Go to shops and do some shopping along the way. And these towns, particularly out west, many of our major cities today start off as kind of boom towns. At the same time, though, if the railroad doesn't really go through your town, and it goes through kind of the next neighboring town, most of those little small towns will dry up and die and become known as ghost towns. And there's still examples of that today out west. One of the biggest railroads that we'll talk about is something known as the Transcontinental Railroad, and it was proposed by a guy by the name of Leland Stanford, who ran the Union Pacific Line. He had this idea to have a railroad that went all the way across the United States, and so His Union Pacific, along with the Central Pacific, will meet up at a place called Promontory Point, and he'll drive a golden spike. We'll talk more about that in class, but it really begins to link the country together, because before, if you lived on the East Coast, you maybe were off by yourself. You felt a little, or even on the East Coast, you lived to yourself. If you're in the West Coast, you might have felt a little isolated and off by yourself, because you really didn't have a way to connect or get back and forth across the country, other than maybe horse and carriage, and that could take months to get from California to New York, say. Also, one of the reasons why railroads become so popular is because steel becomes cheaper. It's safer to make it, it's stronger than iron, and so as that happens and the more tracks are laid, there's this idea that we really need to start linking the country together, and that's where that transcontinental railroad comes in. Because of that, you also get time zones. We'll talk about that more in class, but the railroads actually are the first to create time zones in America. Now, because steel is so profitable, you have people who are going to make millions upon millions of dollars about this. And many of these people will get the nickname of robber barons. And one of them is this man right here, Andrew Carnegie. He becomes a monopolist. He really begins to run the steel market in America. By the time of his death, though, he will start to give away some of his money, and he'll give away over $450 million. At one point, though, America was producing 1/3 of all the world's steel due to something known as the Bessemer process that made steel easier and cheaper and stronger to make. Carnegie at one point was worth $1.4 billion. And he really comes to signify the rich and wealthy of this time. Another individual we need to talk about is a guy by the name of Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller really begins to push into the area of oil, and he sees a market for it early on, and so he'll create what's known as the Standard Oil Company. He really first pushed into kerosene and converting oil into kerosene to light homes. Eventually, he'll move into gasoline and use that then when cars come on the scene, when Henry Ford creates his first automobiles. He'll start to use the gasoline as a way to power those cars, making millions of dollars. He also really believed in consolidation, so he wanted to own the supply of the oil, he wanted to own the oil fields, and he wanted to own the distribution, the oil refineries and oil and gas stations. At one point, he owned 95% of all oil refineries in the United States, and he would use illegal rebates and spies to kind of control the industry and make sure that he knew exactly what his competition was doing and how much they were going to sell their prices for, so he could undercut them and drive them out of business. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these robber barons were not looking out for their employees, and many workers kind of just felt like cogs in a machine. They really felt like they were just there as a moving part. They weren't really people. Free enterprise and farming, that free enterprise being able to start your own business and farming really begin to be replaced by a corporation. People oftentimes will give up the family farm because they really can't make money in the competitive world and will move to cities to look for better jobs. Factory life really begins to kind of control the way America works. People go to work on a whistle and know when to go on a break because of whistles, and know when it's time to go home because of whistles. At one point, 2/3 of America was dependent on wage, which means they were actually dependent on their money. So most people actually, the unemployment was not based on a lack of effort, but kind of on larger economic issues, on whether there was enough jobs simply for people to have, or whether or not you even made enough money at your businesses. I mean, today we talk about minimum wages, but at that point, there was nothing for people to be able to make that extra money, to have that guarantee, that worker safety net, to make sure that they weren't going to be left high and dry by their business owner. Now, because of that feeling of anxiety and isolation, many workers begin to try to organize and create labor unions. Most manual laborers felt really vulnerable because the employers could just simply get rid of them and bring somebody new in, or bring an immigrant worker in. So if you were maybe on a railroad, for instance, and you're building this railroad, if you're not doing exactly what your boss wants, they could replace you with cheap labor and pay somebody even cheaper to do it, because most of the people who are coming to this country were searching for better lives for themselves, because what they had experienced in Europe was really not palatable to them. They weren't getting the life that they had wanted, and so they were coming to America looking for that, and they would often take the cheapest job they could find so that they could make money. In many places, too, machines began to displace workers. So, for instance, if you had a job making clothes previously where you made them by hand, you might suddenly be replaced by a sewing machine that could do it faster than you could by sewing by hand. Corporations often make labor unions impossible because they would control the legal process. They would find lawyers and judges who were on their side, who would help try to pass laws or win cases for them that would outlaw labor unions. If that didn't work, then if if a union worker went on strike, the boss would often hire what people are known as scabs. Scabs were people who would go in to work at a job when other workers were on strike. Or they would have strike breakers, people whose job it was to either go in kind of under the radar and really push back and try to break up the union, or try to make people question why they were striking. Finally, if all of that didn't work, you might, if you were a boss, create a company town. Company towns were basically towns where the business is owned by your employer, the local grocery store is owned by your employer, the restaurants down the street are owned by your employer, the house you live in is owned by your employer. So all of the money you are spending, all the money you are making is made and spent in your boss's control. And so they're making literally every piece of money they can possibly make from you. It's because of those very conditions of things where there's strike breakers and scabs and low wages and long hours that many workers start to unite. And one of the first labor unions is a group called the Knights of Labor. Their goal was to replace what was known as the National Labor Union. But it was such a thing. It was such an area where you could be punished for it, that it was often started as a secret society. So many laborers many people of the members of the Knights of Labor didn't openly say that they were part of it. One of the things that was unique about the Knights of Labor is they were actually open to everyone. Some of the earlier labor unions segregated or kept their membership separated based on race or gender, or you had to be a certain class to work in to be part of that labor union. As a result, the Knights of Labor really open up to everybody. So women can be involved, African Americans, Latinos, men and women of all stripes can. They were a bit overzealous, though, and they talked about social reform and changing society. So they didn't want to just change the businesses. They wanted to change America as a whole. And that kind of becomes unrealistic after a while, because you're just a labor union. You're not this large body that can really dictate terms to people. The heyday of the Knights of Labor really comes to an end at what was known as the Haymarket Square incident. In Chicago, there's a protest by the Knights of Labor. They're marching. We largely believe that it was the result of anarchists, but a stick of dynamite goes off. It injures some police officers. It causes chaos. It leads to riots, and people fighting, and it really destroys the the reputation of the Knights of Labor. Most historians believe that the Knights of Labor actually had nothing to do with the bombing, that it was an anarchist group that was there to kind of cause chaos and push against the government. But the Knights of Labor largely get blamed for it. Finally, you have the American Federation of Labor, and this labor group really does step in and kind of fill the void for the Knights of Labor. It's started by a guy by the name of Samuel Gompers, and his is much more realistic. He's going to focus less on societal changes, much more on changing the business itself. So they're going to focus on wages, having a livable wage, being able to make money and provide for your family, and not just working basically for free. Cutting it down to an 8-hour workday. Previously, you might work 12 to 14 hours, and you could be fired if you did not adhere to that policy. They also wanted to improve working conditions and make it safer for these people. And the way that they would get this is they would do walkouts or boycotts and go on strike. And the idea is if you go on a strike or if you walk out from your job, it really does affect the business, because the owner either has to hire scabs, somebody to replace you, or they have to negotiate, because otherwise they're not making money, and when a business isn't making money, they run the risk of failing. By 1900, the view of labor unions had started to change, and they were no longer seen as these kind of anarchist chaos starters. They were started to be seen as a vital part of the business relationship of America, that workers needed protection, just like the businesses had protection. Many people begin to believe that the workers really need somebody to look out for them as well. When we talk about this era, we really do have to talk a little bit about the people who kind of are the most well-known, the kind of famous families of America, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Leland Stanfords of the group. And there's always this kind of push and pull of, are they known as the captains of industry, these people who really built America and made America strong and wealthy? Or are they robber barons? Are they people who kind of took advantage of the working class and the poor of America and made them, work for poor wages and low and bad working conditions? there's really, you're going to have a push and pull either way, and really historians haven't completely made their mind up about this. We do know that class tensions were never as big a deal in America as in Europe, and so there wasn't this same pushback against these people that there was maybe in Europe. It does this time, though, it does create beliefs of upward mobility, and so because of things like labor unions, you suddenly feel like you can kind of pull yourself up and work your way out of this life that you've been given. But it does end up destroying kind of ideas of capitalism. Before, in the idea of capitalism, the government stays out of the way. It's completely run by businesses. They make their policies. They decide what to do, what to make, how much to make for it. And now you're having employees have a say, and you're eventually going to start having the government start to have a say and create regulation. And so it's going to slowly erode at that idea of laissez-faire capitalism that had really dictated American economy for the previous 100 years. And finally, you start to get two classes, in social classes in America. You have what is known as the labor class, who are the owners of the labor class, those robber barons, those captains of industries. And then you have the labor class, the workers themselves. And so you really begin to have this start to push and pull back. This will lead into a time known as the Gilded Age, which we'll talk about in our next video, and eventually into a time known as the Progressive Era, where finally these workers start to get the ear of politicians, start to get them on their side, guys like Teddy Roosevelt, and start to really help pull the worker up out of the rough living and working conditions that they had seen, and start to hold the accountable the business owners of America. So that's really it. Make sure you have this all in your notes. If it took you 2 times to watch this video, that's totally fine, but you need to have all of this in your Cornell notes set up. Make sure you complete your summaries, make sure you complete any keywords and pull those out. There's a lot in this video. And if you have any other questions, please see me in class. Otherwise, have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.